is cap the rate that our budget can grow from year to year in Georgia. We know already as a state that we're required constitutionally to balance our budget. I think because of that stability that our state's in solid fiscal shape. But moving forward, I think it would be an even better policy for our state for us just to place a restriction on the rate that we allow that budget to grow. And so the resolution itself says that we're not going to allow our budget from one fiscal year to the next to exceed in growth greater than a inflationary amount that's tied to the consumer price index, and that any excess funds that we receive as a state above that will first be spent filling our reserve funds. And should we ever get to a point where our reserve funds are maxed out and we still continue to have revenue that exceeds our restriction, then that money would be sent back as a tax rebate to income taxpayers in our state. And I know there's a lot of times there's questions about emergencies and what we don't want to handcuff ourselves too much, and I've tried to be cognizant of that. And so you can see on lines 20 through 23, we've also put a provision in place should the legislature feel that an emergency or really any instance required us to exceed this restriction, that it could be this legislation could be overrode with a 2/3 vote of both the House and the Senate.
So, committee have any questions of the author on the measure? And it's fairly straightforward. We actually have a gentleman will make a presentation about some future liabilities we have. We may hear about that, and we might decide that if we had that after we fill the reserve fund, the gentleman might entertain, we need to fill those next before we grow government, if you will. But he's been very open and honest, forthright with me, and talking about what he wishes to do, and I'm sure we'll work with the committee members.
Absolutely. So this is the beginning of a conversation that I know is going to take at least multiple years. And so if anyone has a question, concern, if you think of one after the meeting, I'd be glad to meet with you and talk with you about it. This for me is just another one of those common sense measures, where we're just trying to make sure that, the Georgia of our future is just as great of a Georgia as what we're enjoying today.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
My fellow Georgia Bulldog fan and Nick Chubb. We share Nick Chubb as a constituent right now.
Good. Representative Kelly, what, if any, impact do you think this would have on our AAA bond rating in the future and our ability to raise funds to pay off our debts?
I think that we have when we capped our income tax rate this year. I know some credit agencies had just a little heartburn.
They did raise their eyebrows.
But I think that what we're doing here is they're mostly just concerned with making sure they're able to get payment back, that our obligations are able to be met. And so that's why I think it's important that we're first requiring our reserve funds to be built up. And I think any bond rating agency would take into account the reserve funds that we have. And also the fact that we are putting in a provision to, if we needed to override this, that we could. And so I don't think that this would be something that would cause a lot of concern for the bond rating agencies. I think it actually would even make them feel a little bit better that since we're restricting our future expenses to match the cap that we've already placed on the revenue that we're having.
And follow up. And yeah, I agree with you on that. If I would like to see some sort of opinion from the bond agencies and the folks that make those determinations before we move forward with something like this, just to make sure. It was a little nerve-wracking last year capping the income tax and having the article show up in the Wall Street Journal, and I think we need to be very aware of that stuff.
I certainly agree with you. I'm proud of our AAA bond rating. Wouldn't want to do anything that would cause us to lose that. So I'll see if I can hunt down some guidance or opinions on that for you.
Thank you.
Go Dogs.
Thank you. And yes, what you said. Well, to look at this, I mean, you're looking to appropriate funds. You're nothing. This resolution talks about if funds, if you will, pour in because the economy really ramps up and there's a lot of transactions going on, there's a lot of revenue. You're just talking about we should have specific manners what we do with that money first, not limiting the revenue. So it might actually be a good companion to the capping of the income tax, but it's certainly fair, Representative, you bring a good point. I mean, perhaps we could even invite somebody or more than one from the bond rating agencies to discuss, the current situation of the state and how this may affect it. Representative Caldwell.
I was going to speak to that point, but I think we've kicked that dead horse, so thank you.
Any further questions of the gentleman? If not, Representative Kelly, thank you very much. We'll let you know probably after day 30 if we wish to discuss this any further so that you would have the committee's further thoughts to look at over the interim. So we appreciate it very much. I'm going to ask if anybody has any brief comments and about it. You're welcome to stay for that. If you need to get back to your committee, we'll make note of those and make sure they get in touch with you if you need to go.
Well, I appreciate that so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to one point I want to just drive home again. Right now we're having a conversation about tax reform, and I'm certainly one who believes in the long run that we need to take steps to reduce our state's income tax. But I also want to do it in a very responsible manner that takes in mind that sometimes when you cut taxes, there's a loss of revenue for a short period of time, and so I look at this as this mechanism of the tax rebate where you're still able to give people income tax relief should our revenue in our state experience such a great growth in our budget. And so that's just something that I want to hammer on. I think this is a very responsible way for us to accomplish several goals here in our state. So thank you for giving me the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, and I hate that I won't be able to stick around, but I appreciate you being willing to share those comments or concerns, and I look forward to being back before you again soon.
Thank you, Representative Kelly.
Thank you.
Again, to the audience, keeping in mind that we have a presentation, but if someone came and they would like to share their brief comments on the measure, keeping in mind that we'll have full testimony later, but to get on the record that you would like to be a party to and part of the conversation going forward, now would be the time for, I don't know that we have a sign-up sheet, but if you'd like to just come forward, either if you'd like to just stand there, we'll turn you on over there.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, committee Chairman Martin and the committee and Representative Kelly. My name is Taifa Butler, and I'm the incoming executive director for the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. And we appreciate the opportunity to speak briefly today, but also want to engage in this conversation going forward. House Resolution 305, also known as the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TABOR, as it's commonly known, is a rigid formula-based limit on state investments, and we believe that it would cripple Georgia's ability to adequately fund education, transportation, even as we're having this debate right now in our state on needing more revenues to fund the not just maintenance, but the critical work that has to happen to increase our transportation infrastructure. So I just want to go on record to say we want to talk about this as a way to address a problem that we're trying to solve that doesn't exist. I think when we talk about capping spending for the state, Georgia is already one of the lowest taxing states and spending states in the country. We're 46th when you take into account state and local revenue per person. We're 50th when it comes to Medicaid spending. We're 47th in the nation when it comes to transportation spending. So overall, we are spending very minimal in a lot of these instances. And when we try to tie state revenues to inflation and population growth, we have to keep in mind that government services grow at a much faster rate. For example, from 1996 to 2011, Georgia's population grew by 31%, but our Medicaid and Peach Care population grew by 70%, and the student enrollment grew by 78%. So just want to keep in mind as we talk about capping revenues and capping spending, there are services that our state provides that would be tremendously impacted by a cap and how much revenue we would put in our budget. And secondly, we need to learn from Colorado's experience. It was a failed experiment in Colorado, so much so that they voted to repeal its constitutional amendment for TABOR. And also in terms of bond rating, Colorado was downgraded. Its bond rating was downgraded when they passed TABOR and had tremendous budget cuts that affected education spending and all the other important services that the state provided. So just want to go on record. We would love to engage in this conversation, are very concerned about TABOR moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I would appreciate your organization's involvement. I know you have a lot of folks over there that go through the numbers, and we'd love to have your involvement. Any further members of the audience that wish to speak to the resolution? Yeah, hang on one second. Anybody else wish to speak to the resolution? If not, we'll take further comment at a later date on it, but I appreciate everybody coming forward. I give you Representative Kelly. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think one thing that I've tried to really take into consideration is not to make this bill rigid, and that's why we put forth a provision to allow it to be overrode should 2/3 of both chambers decide that there's such a need that arises to break this restriction, and that's something that does differ from the Colorado model, and so I'm trying to be cognizant of that and put forth something that makes sense fiscally for our state and for our state taxpayers and for the future of Georgia. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Representative Kelly. And I would say this to Ms. Butler and to you, Representative. I think we may even find in different places different things to kick in. I think she brings up a good point that just population and just inflation may not measure the student growth and so forth. And I think you want to fund an adequate level of service for the programs that we're doing now. What I hear in our conversations before the committee meeting is what you're concerned with is when more money rolls in, there's a lot of people that show up at the Capitol that have a special project and a plan for us to do it. I say all dollars have constituency, and what you're worried and what you would like for us to take control of is when those extra dollars come in to have places that we first take care of the needs, our reserve fund, our future debts that we may segue in just really well here to the state auditor to take care of. You're not looking to handcuff the state so that if enrollment growth doubles and as related to population that we don't have money to fund that in our conversation. So I think you would be open to a good conversation. Thank you very much, and we appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, we went a little bit over the 10 minutes we were going to do that, but I appreciate our next presenter waiting for us and giving the representative the opportunity to do that now. We have the opportunity today to have with us Greg Griffin. He is our state auditor from the state of Georgia Department of Audits and Accounts. For everybody that would be wondering and scared, he will not audit your taxes. No, he's not that kind of an auditor. He is the one that helps us keep up with those dollars that we have and those dollars that we are spending through our various programs. And in fact, he's going to talk to us a little bit today about some of the rules that have changed about pensions and our long-term liabilities that too oft times in government get overlooked. So without further ado, I really appreciate it, Mr. Auditor. I know you have several things you're doing over there, and we appreciate the opportunity for you to come in and talk with us. I'll turn the meeting over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to talk to you about the state's long-term liabilities. We'll focus a little bit on the pension liabilities, other post-employment liabilities, and some leave liabilities. Before we get started, just for full disclosure, actually you have a handout. You should have a handout in your packet that we'll go through. And Mr. Chairman, please keep me on time and task. If we need to speed up, please give me the sign. As information, I am an ex officio member of many of the pension boards in the state, and I sit on the ERS board, the TRS board, and again a number of the smaller pension plans. So I do have certain fiduciary responsibilities to those plans and to the plan participants as we go through this discussion. If we go to page 2 or slide 2, again, I'm going to talk about some of the numbers, the long-term liabilities in the state. Before we get into those details, just to provide a little context with respect to pensions, we've had some new pension accounting rules come out over the last couple of years, and there have been changes to the way all states and clearly the state of Georgia, the way they account for their pension expense, and we'll talk about those differences in a few minutes. So if we look at the agenda, I am going to speak to these new accounting rules. They are different than the funding rules. I'll hit the key changes. I'll try to highlight those. I'll talk about the implications, and then I'm going to use an illustration to work through the impacts through a sample valuation. I'll then go ahead and present some liability numbers for pensions, both under the new accounting rules and the funding rules, and contrast those numbers, and you can see the differences. And time permitting, we'll talk about some other liabilities, OPEB, I apologize for the acronym, other post-employment benefits. That's essentially retiree medical. Those are some big liabilities that we have in the state that are not as well funded, if you will, as our pension plans. With that, I'll turn over to slide 3. In 2012, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board has approved 2 new pension accounting standards. First, Statement 67. That provides guidance on how plans do their accounting and reporting. Okay, 68 also was promulgated, and that provides guidance on how employers account for their pension costs. Okay, GASB 67 was effective in fiscal year 14, so that was last year. GASB 68 is effective in fiscal year 15, the year that we're currently in. So some of the impacts that we'll talk about, the impacts we'll talk about, you'll see those on our financial statements later this year. And there's lots of meetings going on today throughout the state in terms of preparing for that implementation. Just one note, the impacts that we're going to talk about today relative to the new pension standards impact our external, our GAAP-based financial statements. You may or may not be aware we actually have 3 sets of financial statements and 3 different bases of accounting in the state. We have the budgetary basis, we have a governmental basis, and then we have a full accrual GAAP basis. The impacts we're talking about today are on the full accrual GAAP-based financial statements. These impacts will not affect our current budgetary-based financial statements that you see in the budgetary compliance report. If we go to slide 4, there are 3 key changes that we need to be aware of. There is, again, going to be a decoupling of the accounting, the expense, from the funding calculations. Today, whatever we fund, we typically expense. They equal. Tomorrow, you're going to have 2 different numbers. You're going to have an accounting number, a pension expense number, a funding number. They're going to be 2 very different numbers and have no relationship. Okay, we'll talk about that. Second impact is a balance sheet issue. So the employers that participate in these pension plans will now have to record a liability on their balance sheet, or in governmental terms, the statement of net position. So these employers will record the unfunded or the funded status on their financial statements beginning at the end of fiscal year 15. You will typically see that number. If you want to try to relate it to a number today, you'll see that number in the footnotes to the financial statements. It's the unfunded accrued actuarial liability. It's similar, but these 2 liabilities are calculated under different bases. Some of those differences are here on the slide. The new liabilities will be based on market value of assets, not a smooth value of assets. And you can see some of these other differences here. I'm not going to make you pension experts today, so I'll move on. The third change are expanded disclosures that you'll see in all of the financial statements. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of those, or actually any of those disclosure items. I'm going to stick to the pension expense and the balance sheet changes. If we turn to, please stop me, by the way, if you have any questions. If we turn to slide 5, this is some additional detail about the differences between the old funding rules and the new accounting rules. A lot of this Some of this is terminology changes. So looking at that first bullet under funding, for funding purposes, again, you should be familiar with the term annual required contribution. That is what we typically fund every year in our pension plans. That phrase, that terminology is being eliminated under the new pension rules and replaced with actuarial determined contributions. Bottom line, these new pension rules do not change the way we calculate the funding amounts. So contributions, amounts, methods, and assumptions that you use for funding will remain the same. They will not change. For accounting and reporting, some terminology changes there, and again, some actual calculation differences. Annual pension cost is being replaced with pension expense, and again, those calculations are very different. And the amount that's going to be recorded on the balance sheet, you'll hear me refer to as the net pension liability, or the NPL. The key takeaway: no changes to your funding, and what's down at the bottom of the page in the call-out box, the new pension expense is not intended and is not appropriate for use in determining plan funding. So again, two different numbers for two different reasons. On slide 6, a little bit about the net pension liability, or the NPL. Again, this is going to be an amount that's going to be added to the balance sheets, or again, the statement of net positions for all employers. How you get that amount is the NPL is equal to the total pension liability of the plan minus the plan's assets. Okay, and those assets are going to be based on fair value. Again, the old methodology based on an actuarial smooth value. The liabilities that are calculated are a little different than under the funding methodologies. However, in the case of Georgia, well, let me go to that next bullet. The accounting standards require all employers and plans to calculate their liabilities using one actuarial cost method, which is this entry age and normal costs. For funding purposes, I think there are over 6 different types of actuarial cost methods. So from a comparability standpoint, the accounting rulers wanted to have comparability, so they mandated one actuarial cost method. The discount rate that will be used for the new pension rules is equal to the expected investment rate of return. In most cases, that's going to be equal to the discount rate that we use for funding purposes. There are and could be situations in which those discount rates will be different. And the rate typically for the new pension rules would be lower than what you would see for funding. In the state of Georgia, in this year of implementation, we are using the same discount rate for both accounting and funding. There's a very lengthy and complex process to go through to determine whether you can use the same discount rate or not. Again, to the extent you can't, you can see there on one of those sub-bullets that rather than use the expected rate of return, you would have to use a lower rate of return, which would be equal to the high-quality 20-year tax-exempt municipal bond rate. So that's much lower than the current discount rates that we're using, which are about 7.5%. The key takeaway here on this slide is that third bullet from the bottom. This first year impact is going to be significant due to the size of the NPL. Those numbers are in the billions, and we're going to share some of those numbers with you here in just a minute or two. So significant numbers, billions with a B, is significant to the state, and it is significant to all the employers that are participating in any of these plans, whether it be ERS or TRS. that next bullet, second bullet from the bottom, again, all employers are going to recognize a share of the liability depending on what type of pension plan you have. You could recognize either all of the plan liability or some proportionate share. ERS and TRS are good examples of that. Those are cost-sharing plans. Lots of employers that participate in that plan, those employers will pick up their proportionate share of this total pension liability, and that'll probably be based on their contribution effort relative to the total contribution effort. Questions for a second? Let me stop there. Yep.
In your presentation, but I would like to ask, you mentioned the last bullet point on the slide, the net pension liability, I believe my acronym usage is correct, likely to be volatile from year to year with changing market value of assets. So to be considered, a pension plan to be considered well-funded, if you will, given that delta that'll go back, or the beta, I guess, in investment terms that would go back from that, there's going to be now, instead of the range will be more fluid than it has been in the past. There used to be more of a sort of a static number. Hey, if your pension's funded below this, you're sort of in trouble. But now they're going to have more of a range that it would bounce in based on the value of the investment market, correct?
Pension expenses, again, it's going to be based on market values. Contribution rates are, again, they use smooth asset values. And, again, contribution, the funding process is to generate a smooth, stable contribution amount over the long term.
Okay.
That's not the objective of the accounting guides.
I gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
And I have, again, we'll see an example of that in a couple slides.
Okay.
Slide 7 is some details on how pension expense is going to be calculated. I'm not going to go through this entire slide. The short version of this is the expense that's going to be determined is really a function of looking at the change in the net pension liability from year to year. Okay, so we'll look at that change. There are various components that make up that change. Some of those components will be recognized as pension expense in the current year immediately. Some of those components will be deferred and amortized over some period of time in the current and future periods. And again, you can see some of those examples there down about the fourth bullet: liability gain or loss, asset gain or loss, etc. So those are again the types of things that will be deferred and then amortized over future periods. Again, just as another reminder, can't say it enough, second from the bottom, pension expense is not an annual contribution or a funding amount. It is a change in the net pension liability that's going to get recognized from one year to the next. Moving to slide 8, again, I'm going to reiterate some of the key implications of the new standards. These new rules, again, represent a shift in focus from the long-term commitment to fund to a short-term snapshot of funded status. So the accounting rules look at liabilities at a point in time on the balance sheet. Putting the net pension liability on the balance sheet, if you will, again, is going to add a large number, and it's going to be an unstable element to all employers' financial statements and positions. Again, these numbers are material to most, if not all, employers, and they will be volatile again because of the use of market value of assets. Pension expense recorded on the financial statements, again, significantly different than the actuarially determined contributions that are, again, calculated based on funding methodologies, completely different than the rules that are in these new accounting standards. And then lastly, we're going to have two different cost numbers floating around, one expense number, one funding number. And these will present some communications challenges, if you will, to explain the differences between those two numbers and the data sets underlying those numbers. So let me move to the next slide, and we'll look at a sample valuation, if you will, and it'll illustrate some of the differences, Chairman, that you just mentioned. So on slide 9, a basic set of assumptions for the graph that you're going to see on the next slide. The key assumption here. This is actually an employer. It's not one of our employers. This is actually an employer in one of the GMA plans. But this illustrates again the point and the volatility that you're going to see relative to the new pension standards. The key assumption to bring to your attention is the third bullet up from the bottom. All assumptions, again, all the actuarial voodoo that goes on, all those assumptions are met throughout this 20-year projection period. The first 10 years are going to be like the 1990s, where we had asset returns that were really good, much larger than our assumed discount rate or our assumed expected rate of return. The second half of the next 10 years, the 2000s, where we had negative asset returns. We'll show how the contribution amounts move and how the pension expense numbers move as well. So looking at slide 10, what you see there, again, if you look at the blue line, those are your funding amounts per year, and you can see that it generally is fairly consistent. It is, again, the objective of funding is to come up with stable contribution amounts and rates over the long term. So you see this fairly consistent line throughout the 20-year period. The orange line are the pension expense amounts by year as accounted for under the new pension standards. So you can see the volatility in the annual pension expense from year to year. A couple concerns that we all should have based on this picture. First of all, if you look at the periods 11 through 17, in those cases you see pension expense is much larger than the contribution amount. So what we have to be careful of are the headlines that we'll see in the papers. State shirks its responsibility to fund pension plan. That is a possibility. Okay. The other, and I think the larger concern is the period between period 6 and period 10. So, what's going on there?
Not to interrupt, but yeah, my largest concern and you may be getting there, but it's not true. That's where perhaps the retirees come in and want an increase in their pension because everything is looking good.
Possibly. So period 6 to 10.
Right.
Okay.
You're
actually saying pension in. So what's being recorded there is pension income. Okay, which is not. That's pretty much funny money, monopoly money. That is not something that we want, and you can't take and spend on benefits and those types of things. So that we have to be careful about both of these extremes as we move forward.
Again, I'm the one slowing you down in your presentation, but to be clear that if you were to the high point, if you were to come in and look at those, pensioners could see, oh, look, they're way ahead of the ball here. We should, now is a good time to ask for an increase in the pension. It can afford the money's put there for us for retirement. It can afford an increase, and yet shortly after that we drop back down below the blue line. So that's what we would have to, or the pension boards would have to.
Yes.
Be educated to and aware of that these wild swings in fluctuation doesn't necessarily mean that you cut pension or you cut the benefits if you're down there, or you raise them if you're above the line, but you keep the straight and steady course.
I think from a funding perspective and an additional benefits, we'll probably stay focused on the contribution, the funding line, and take a look at the funded status that's associated with that. And clearly, as a member of the board, the financial stability and the health of the plan is utmost of importance to us. And to your point, as the funded status begins to move closer to 100%, right now we're down below 80%. We have a path forward to get back to 100%. But to your point, Mr. Chairman, as we approach 100%, there will be some pressure to, again, perhaps increase COLAs or benefits. We need to be aware of that. Slide 11. So these are amounts that are calculated under the new pension rules. So these, what you see here, are total liabilities, assets, the net pension liabilities, again calculated under the new pension rules. The first plan here that you see is the ERS plan, the Employees Retirement Plan. Again, what you see there is in effect a $3.7 billion unfunded liability, net pension liability, where the liabilities exceed the plan assets. And the funded ratio, if you under this convention, the new pension rules, is 77.9%. Under the new pension rules, again, most of the employers in the ERS plan are state agencies. Most of that $3.7 billion is going to be picked up by the state on its financial statements. Contrast that with the teachers' retirement system, the next plan down, $79 billion in liabilities, $66 billion in assets. Again, at fair market value, there's a $12 billion net pension liability. I don't have hard, fast numbers, but we're estimating that around 20 to 25% of that number will be reflected on the state's financial statements. The remainder of that $12 billion is going to be picked up by the local school boards, as they are participants in the teachers' retirement system. Those numbers that those school boards are going to be picking up are going to be material, and in many cases, again, on their GAAP-based financial statements, cause them to go into a negative fund balance. So, again, large numbers. The remainder of the plans here that you see here on slide 11 or 12 are some of the other pension plans that you can see. Again, much smaller numbers. In a couple of cases there, you actually see a net pension asset where the assets are greater than the liabilities. Moving to slide 13, these are the equivalent numbers calculated using the funding calculations. And here we're able to provide you with some historical numbers and projections out several fiscal years out. These amounts are in our bond documents, so these are public information. Just this first slide on 13 is the ERS plan. Give you a second to take a look at those, and then I can bring your attention to a couple numbers in that table. So, first of all, for ERS, if you look at valuation year 2014 and fiscal year 17, you'll see the peak for the ARC, for the contribution amount. It peaks out in that year and declines going forward. So there is there's a top of the mountain in terms of the contribution amount. If you look at those shaded boxes, you can compare those amounts are equivalent back to the assets and liability calculations back under the GASB calculations. So in the case of, again, ERS, we've got a $12 billion actuarial value of assets compared to a $13 billion market value of assets. The liabilities are about the same. They're both about $17 billion. Here, the unfunded liability is $4.8 million, $4.9 million. Again, for under the pension rules, the net pension liability amount is going to be $3.8 million. Again, again, we're comparing a 71.4% funded ratio here to a 77.99% funded ratio under the new pension rules. The other numbers you might want to look at are the ARC payments for fiscal year 2015 and 16. The chairman has asked me, what amounts are actually being funded to the plan. So if you look at those, these are the ARC payments that are the total payments to the ERS plan. If you look out to the far right under the state portion of the ARC, you'll see the portion that the state is going to pay, and the difference between the 2016 and 15 ARCs is about $44 million. That's a part of the $150 million. We'll add the TRS number and sort of come back to your change in the current budget. On slide 14, it's similar numbers for the TRS plan. You can compare the same shaded areas back to the previous slides. You can see, again, for those same years, what the state portion of the ARC is, what the increase is over year. It's about $89.5 million. In these projections, and again, these are all projections, and again, these projections are only as good as when they were made. They changed significantly, probably since then.
Mr. Griffin, and perhaps there's a lot of things. If this is not a short answer, then we can take it offline. But the ARC payment, the state portion of the ARC payment, or in fact the overall ARC payment for TRS, from 2014 to 2017 went up $1 billion. Well, $900 million, right? Proportionally, it went up a lot more than the ERS system. Is that because in the projections we project that there'll be more teachers, more people in the TRS? Or
I don't think that's the reason. I would want to research the exact reason.
I just wondered if it was a different.
Back to you.
Yeah, I would not have thought it would have been just raw numbers of a number of teachers in the system would have made it gone up.
We're not assuming any addition. These are all based on existing employees at the time. So
right. So it must be something relative to discount rates or returns or.
Yes.
Okay. Fair enough.
So I will.
Because $1 billion here, $1 billion there, before you know it, you're talking real money.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of money.
So that's all the slides I have on the pension plans. Again, those are, even though we have some large liabilities, we do have some significant assets that have been funded and are in trust. The next couple of slides are our OPEB liabilities. So on slides 15 and 16, we have, so the information here are numbers, a 4-year history, if you will. We have some rather large unfunded liabilities. Again, these are in the billions. We have 2 OPEB plans, if you will, that are tied to the the state health benefit plan. These plans that you see here are operating today on a pay-as-you-go basis. There is no pre-funding going on. Changes that are made to plan design for SHBP directly impact the liabilities and cost here. The plan has made some changes over the last several years. If you look at the fourth bullet down, in 2012, the plan implemented a sliding scale in terms of calculating the subsidy for the retiree health based on the years of service that you have, and that was effective for new hires after January 1, 2007. I think another key takeaway on this slide, if you will, is the last bullet. So this whole discussion we've had around pension accounting and having to book liabilities on financial statements, the GASB is deliberating new OPEB accounting rules that will pretty much follow the accounting for pensions. And at some point, 3 or 4 or 5 years out in the future, employers participating in these types of plans will also have to record these liabilities on their books as well. 16, again, is information on the Board of Regents. They have a separate OPEB plan. And then the last slide is 17, is a snapshot of our compensated absences liabilities, our accrued leave, if you will. And it is, if you look at the numbers, it's fairly constant at about $500 million over the last 5 years. And again, this liability is booked on our GAAP-based financial statements. These are not on our budgetary set of books. And with that, I'll entertain any further questions.
Thank you, sir. That was a good presentation, and not that you should get that grade from the chair, or the chair should feel confident in grading your presentation, but that's very complicated information that you and I have talked over many times, and you put it in a great format for my eyes to be able to follow something that, I haven't been that familiar with for a number of years. I really appreciate the time. I know that it's a non-trivial task for you and your staff to put that together. I think it is important for the committee to realize that what I had hoped to show, with our charter here at the committee, is to realize that sometimes when there are monies that come into the state and people wonder where those things must go, you don't see an ARC contribution. If I'm using one of your acronyms, you don't see the annual required contribution. If that goes up, where we're seeing it in TRS, if that goes up over $1 billion in the next 4 years, and our state revenue goes up $1 billion, and people are going to go, where'd y'all spend that money? It's in promises that were made in a pension system going back how many years, Mr. Griffin? I mean, 30, 40, 50 years ago. We just have to keep those things in mind as we're looking to allocate the budget. But I really appreciate it. Are there questions of the gentleman relative to the presentation we've made? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I guess it's a general question. And thank you for this presentation. I'm about to start using TRS in a few months. And so I'm just wondering, are we ever, our funding level ever more than what it should be? Are we always in the liability capacity, so forth? Because I'm noticing we always have more, we're spending more than we have. And I know that we are an aging society now, and so I know TRS and a lot of the other retirement services are now going up because we have more people that are aging. So, but are we ever in a plus instead of a minus all the time?
There are lots of factors that go into that. One of the significant inputs is the market. So, to the extent the market generates, an average of 10 or 15% return over the next several years, then the funded status of that plan will look a whole lot better than it looks today. Both ERS and TRS took action recently to set, again, a course to where the plans will be, all things being equal, funded 100%, by the end of the next 25 to 30 years. So those plans took the unfunded liability and said we're going to amortize that to our contribution. So funding's going to continue to stay fairly high, but we're going to amortize and recognize that over the next 25 years. Under the previous, until we made that change, those unfunded amounts just got re-amortized over 30 years or 25 years. So we put measures in place to actually address bringing the funded ratio up over time.
And also as we retire, as it relates to the population. All that's in the formula, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Actuarial voodoo.
Right. Representative Fraser, that's an important point you raised, that the aging, the number of retirees that we see that happening, that's included in. That is projected forward.
Those are all
those
are all
projections
inputs and projections in the
already
liability.
into that
That's
liability
correct.
That more people. There's some other things we all you should have gotten in your office, not just the committee members, but I think every member of the State House should have gotten in their office or through the mail from both the ERS and the TRS system their annual report, and that's interesting, to look at and their investment things.
To be clear, the numbers reflect current FTEs, current people. It doesn't project future employees into the plan. So these liabilities that you see here are only current employees, although we're projecting their liabilities out when we're actually going to start to pay, and
right.
Those are included.
And
in
even going to that point, if there are people before that money that goes into the plan with them that never vest, that shows up as perhaps shows up as a shortfall. But if they leave without vesting, that money stays behind, so that money then gets added to and helps pay off the liability going forward.
Correct.
And I don't think you project a number of people that will or won't stay past 10 years. You assume everybody that is in the plan would stay until a reasonable retirement age, right?
Those are actuarial assumptions. So there are assumptions as to who makes it to retirement, and there are mortality assumptions and all that.
Mortality or moving on to a different career. Okay,
so those are all built
corrected there. They actually do have those assumptions in the model.
They are built into the liability calculations.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I asked that because one of the first classes I took when I became a legislator in 2007 was at the university, and it talked to us about the increase in the retirement rate and how we had not, as a state, prepared for it. And so I know today that we do not have the same amount of people working as we did in the 70s and the 80s who actually paid into the system, where we are now able to benefit from it, a lot of the retirees today. So that's what we're trying to do, build our revenue estimate, get more jobs, keep the economy going so that we can continue to do this for the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a retiree and part of the TRS system, I must say that Georgia has the best one going in the United States, because it's being modeled. Other states have been modeling themselves after Georgia. So thank you, and I look forward to the first of the month every month.
Yes, sir.
We'll make sure that TRS knows to get coaches the retirement pension check he is due. Well, that is what we had on our agenda this afternoon. I would thank you again for the information. We'll get it out to the members that weren't able to join us, and if there are questions, we'll direct them your way. Again, your office has been very available to the chair, and I'm sure you will be to the committee members as they need them. I really appreciate your work. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, does anyone have anything that they'd like to bring before the committee? Anything for the good of the order before we adjourn? Nothing. If there is nothing, then I wish everybody well. We will get a note out. We would plan to have a gathering again probably after day 30. After we get through that we would get together and perhaps talk about this. I'd like to look into this a little bit over the interim. If there's nothing else before the body will stand adjourned without objection. I hear no objection. We are adjourned.